welcome to the second last yours of the autumn term. I don't know some of you, so my name is Sarah Perry, and I will be hosting them mostly in the spring term. John usually does it for the autumn, but I have known Martyn for a while now, and actually he was meant to come last springtime, but because of strikes and other things that were going on, we had to reschedule. So Martyn has kindly come back, and really excited to hear what he has been working on for the last 10+ years.
Yeah, not all the time.
Not all the time. Before I say a little bit more about that, I just wanted to make a note for next week's yours, which is the final one of the autumn term. The presenters, so Paul Graves Brown and Hilary Orange, are coming up. But John has an awesome lecture that he's giving next door right after they're done. So we're starting yours a bit early. So the session will start at 5 next week and then end by 6:45 latest, so that they and maybe everyone, if they can get in, can head over. It's at the Yorkshire Museum in the Tempest at Anderson Hall, and John's going to be talking about his work in the Galapagos, archaeology and the global challenge of marine plastics. So that's exciting. So next week, come at 5, please. And now, without further ado, I wanted to introduce you to Martyn, whose official title, according to our website, is Senior Researcher at Historic England's Aerial Investigation and Mapping team. I've known Martyn for a while now, and in fact was one of the places where I also got to know Colleen quite well when we were working on a project called Visualization in Archaeology, which was funded by English Heritage in the late 2007 to 2011 or something like that. And Martyn then was doing some incredible work with different visualization technologies and ways that we think and see the past. And I think some of that's going to appear in his talk today, but it's all very inspiring research on these tools that we employ to understand the archaeological record. And I think today Martyn's going to be telling us a little bit about the motivations behind different intervention episodes at Stonehenge, particularly in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And he gave me a bit of a debrief, so I'm not going to spoil it all, but there's a lot of exciting and political activities that happen over this period of time. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. God, I feel like I'm going to be disappointing you now.
No.
Yeah, so I should start off by saying, yeah, I work in the Aerial Investigation and Mapping team at Historic England, and before that English Heritage, and before that the Royal Commission on the Historic Monuments of England. Managed to change employer 3 times without changing job. And what I'm going to be talking about tonight, despite appearances, does actually arise from aerial survey work. Specifically, about 10 years ago, we started project work on the Stonehenge Landscape, which back then was connected to a number of things. The fact that we realised that a number of sites and a number of components of the World Heritage Site hadn't been archaeologically examined, surveyed to modern standards. And also the plans were well in train for the new visitor centre, which required up-to-date information on the wider landscape in order to inform its displays. And that project came to an end a few years ago with the publication, and Stonehenge work continues because stuff happens. Back in 2007-8, whenever it was, we had already mapped the World Heritage Site from the air in 2001 as part of what was then called the National Mapping Programme, and it seemed a little pointless to redo it so soon. So I sort of took the opportunity instead to use the same set of aerial photographs to have a look at what had happened in the Stonehenge landscape during the period covered by those photographs. And Stonehenge has quite a lengthy history of being photographed from the air. there's an awful lot of things that came out of it, an awful lot of things I identified as being of interest to me as well as being of interest to other people. There's a sort of Venn diagram there, which doesn't always overlap perfectly. And tonight, what I thought I'd sort of concentrate on is episodes relating to transformations in the appearance of Stonehenge and the landscape around it. Looking at the key events and interventions, by which I don't mean the excavations, I mean the episodes of fiddling with the appearance of Stonehenge and the landscape around it. And looking at some of the motivations and processes that shaped them, and which obviously shaped the setting and the monument that we experience when we visit it today. And particularly interested in chipping away at a narrative that seems to have become established in the literature over the last 3 or 4 decades, which Stonehenge is presented as a site that was essentially a neglected ruin until it passed into state guardianship in 1918, and which these subsequent programs of repair and restoration, whenever I say the word restoration, it's in square quotes, not necessarily that those episodes were necessitated by a succession of Victorian and Edwardian private owners who had allowed it to fall into a potentially dangerous state of disrepair. Just going to sort of pick that apart a little bit. I press. So as I said, Stonehenge has a long history of being photographed from the air. It's unusual but not unique in being photographed from above before the advent of heavy and air flight in the British Isles. Top photograph taken in 1906 from a Royal Engineers military observation balloon, and the bottom one from English Heritage, as it was, Cessna in 2006. And obviously, as you can see, just at a glance, a lot has happened in the 100 years between those two photographs. A lot has continued to happen. But also looking at that 1906 photograph, there's already a lot of stuff in there that needs explaining, which required going back well before 1906 to try and understand. As I said, the context for this research is the project that led to the publication of this book, The Stonehenge Landscape. But particularly tonight, I'm going to be sort of drawing on 2 more detailed research reports that I produced, which you can download for free from our website if you can find them. One dealing with the landscape and one dealing with the monument itself. There are actually loads and loads of these reports available, and this is the place to go if you want to find them. 30 or 40, way more detail than you could possibly ever want to know about Stonehenge. And it continues to be added to. And obviously, the implication here is that I'm drawing on the work of a large number of colleagues, not entirely my own stuff. And I have continued pursuing things, either myself or with people outside historic England, mostly outside historic England anyway. Some of you might be aware of the paper that was published in the Journal of Contemporary Archaeology a couple of years ago. Just wait. Yeah. Which dealt specifically with the application of concrete to megaliths in this late 19th, early 20th century period. And I will also be spending some time a bit later on some unpublished work that was also done with Helen and David Lawrence, who are both based at Kingston University. I suppose, as I'm not in the south, I should say that's Kingston-on-Thames. On Stonehenge, the first purpose-built visitor destination attraction in the Stonehenge landscape. So, transformation of Stonehenge and its landscape. As I said, I'm going to be looking at key interventions. The key episodes of excavation are probably quite familiar to people. William Gowland in 1901, Colonel Hawley between 1919 and 1926, and the Atkinson Pigott Stone years of 52 to 64. And obviously, stuff has continued, Stonehenge Riverside Project, etc., but it's mainly those early ones I'm going to be concentrating on. And particularly the entanglement between those episodes of excavation and the attempts to repair, to restore Stonehenge itself. Since, well, already as you can see, by 1906, there have been some interventions. I'll be looking more closely at one in a moment. But the decisions to straighten leaning stones or to erect fallen ones, sort of partly about stability, where you can't make that argument for the ones that have already fallen. They're not going to fall any further. And there's a question of aesthetics involved as well, but in particular, there's a desire to turn what was an obvious ruin into something more closely resembling ideas about how it might have looked in prehistory. And from the 1920s onwards, those concerns became to be applied to the landscape as well, and not so much to putting it back to how it must have been in the Neolithic, but to turn back the clock in some way. The aerodrome, which I'll be talking about a little bit later, the First World Aerodrome was the key catalyst here, but that's also the developments are set against a sort of wider background of increasing concerns with threats to the countryside, rural amenity and setting and so on. Things like upgrading the road network, urban development along the main roads, suburban expansion, and so on. And this, alongside that, essentially sort of underlying desire, which is sometimes stated quite explicitly by the Office of Works in particular, to set Stonehenge and its immediate setting apart from their contemporary surroundings, effectively to turn a journey to Stonehenge into a journey back in time. Which obviously is not just attempts to prevent new development, but also a desire to strip the landscape of things that were deemed to be inappropriately modern for the setting of the moment. It's an episodic process. There's no grand design that everyone's been working towards. The motivations change, the ideas about what interventions are necessary have changed a lot since 1918 and even prior to 19 as well. And one interesting development recently now is that we see a lot of talk about giving Stonehenge an appropriate setting as opposed to an authentic one. Again, there's a Venn diagram there, and everyone's going to have their different opinions about whether they overlap at all, let alone how much they overlap. So it's not been so much about freezing the past as sort of fluctuating efforts to try and fix a particular, somewhat elusive moment in the landscape and at the site, with variable results, as we'll see. And this has all also been closely entwined with concerns about visitors, not just about how to manage numbers, but how to manage the experience, and in the earlier periods, how to examine the type, how to deal with the type of person that was visiting. The current narrative history of Stonehenge, the one I mentioned, which is as a neglected ruin until 1918, which has complex and obscure origins, but essentially everything that's been published since this book is referring to the contents of this book. This Christopher Chipperdale's Stonehenge Complete. You must regret that title. It's now in its fourth edition. I'm old enough to remember the first edition, unfortunately. But it's the first real presentation of a detailed history rather than a prehistory, compilation of detail about the history of Stonehenge presented in a more or less sort of linear narrative. But particularly as once you get to use this as a source and as a resource, you start to encounter a number of problems with it. One of them is not entirely Christopher Chipperdale's fault. It's the fact that many subsequent retellings, whether they say so or not, are essentially drawing on this. They're not explicitly saying so, and they do tend to overlook some of the detail and some of the nuances of Chippendale's approach. Secondly, the structure sort of reinforces this idea of a site that had a purpose up to a particular point in the past, and then subsequently became an object of curiosity, of study, of research. And in that latter period, things that happen at Stonehenge, if they don't accord with archaeological ideas about Stonehenge's purpose, tend to become problematic. And finally, it is essentially ahistorical. A lot of stuff happens to Stonehenge, but there's very little sense of any of the wider context of the sort of things that are described in there. Obviously, we can contrast that approach with some publications that do take a closer look at some of the more contentious events that have happened in the Stonehenge landscape, particularly its significance and meanings to other groups than just the archaeological community. Although these do have a tendency to focus on more recent times, the 70s, 80s onwards. Although it's interesting that narrative for the late 19th and early 20th century tends to survive intact in these, because it sort of serves the purpose of their approach as well, this idea of this sort of uncaring Victorian private wealthy landowner. uncaring, neglecting, etc. Although sometimes one of the owners, Sir Edmund Antrobus III, is presented as a sort of slightly heroic figure in that he did actually stand up and refuse to do what archaeologists wanted him to do. I should mention, before I get on to private owners, during the 19th, early 20th century, there were 4 successive owners, all called Sir Edmund Antrobus. A lot of the historical accounts of Stonehenge in this period don't always distinguish between them, which can give you the impression that this one really long-lived sort of patriarch of the plains, sort of overseeing goings-on, etc. But the Antrobus family bought Stonehenge and its surroundings from the Duke of Queensberry in 1824. I'm not entirely sure whether there was a requirement that whoever inherited had to be called Sir Edward or Antrobus, but yes, a little bit suspicious. The ones that are mainly interesting today are the third and the fourth one. The third baronet is the guy who actually owned Stonehenge between 1870 and 1898, when it was allegedly neglected and falling into disrepair. And his son, the fourth, is the one who took over and changed everything. As we'll get on to later, try to sell it, etc. One of the more recent episodes, actually, that sort of reflects what I've said about the sort of failure to put things into context is, of course, the Battle of the Beanfield. Very difficult to find now because the road has shifted since 1985. Tremendous amount of literature about this outside the archaeological world. The 30th anniversary in particular was quite noteworthy for its lack of notice in the archaeological world. And when this does occur in things like Stonehenge Complete and other publications on history, it's sort of mentioned in passing as though it's part of the history of the Stonehenge Festival. The wider social, political, cultural implications of what happened at this site are just ignored. And it's also one of these classic cases, as with the earlier periods, where archaeology hasn't really come to terms with its own involvement in setting up the conditions for what actually happened in 1985. Yeah, those quotes aren't in Stonehenge Complete. Anyway, back to that narrative. Stonehenge has been in state guardianship for 100 years this year. You might have noticed there have been a few events relating to it. And this is the kind of thing that is being said about it. So, Cecil and Mary Chubb's generosity saved Stonehenge and transformed it from a neglected ruin to a national treasure. They give start to a program of conservation for the ancient stones in the surrounding landscape. Now, there are a number of stories about Stonehenge's history that recur constantly. This is one of them. I have to say, most of them tend to be dubious at best. I'm sure you're all familiar with the one about people getting off the train at Amesbury and being able to hire a hammer so they could chisel lumps off the stones. It's absolutely not true. And the other one that I always get asked whenever I do these presentations and get onto the airfield is it usually starts with, did you know? Did you know that the RAF wanted to knock Stonehenge down in 1918? Again, not true. It's unbelievable. There are loads of these stories. You might have seen quite frequently the idea that Cecil Chubb went to the auction not to buy Stonehenge, but because his wife wanted some curtains or some furniture. Again, this is not true. The important thing to remember about the purchase is that Cecil might have been the one who stuck his hand up, but it was Mary's money that paid for it. She was the one with the wealth. Cecil Chubb was a barrister who never had to practice because his wife was independently wealthy. Anyway, moving on to the bottom quote, prior to 1918, the monument was propped up with wooden poles and some of the stones were in danger of collapse. So that is what it did look like in 1918. I sort of out of focus barbed wire across the front and the aerodrome buildings that we'll get on to later. So this is one of the first problems that I encountered, the idea that those wooden poles are propping Stonehenge up. They're not. The poles have been propped up against the stones that in 1902 were considered to be the most likely to fall should it ever happen. But the effect of putting those poles up immediately makes Stonehenge look like it's in serious trouble and disrepair. If we jump back to, this is 1881. This is a photograph taken by an architect called John Jenkins Cole, who was the personal architect working for Sir Edmund Antrobus III. the owner at the time. This is taken from the top of one of the lintels of the outer circle, looking towards the cursus barrows that are sort of vaguely northwest from there. Summer of 1881, when this photograph was taken, was quite interesting for a change in approach on the part of Sir Edmund Antrobus, who previously had rejected all demands from archaeologists to do what they wanted to do. And what they'd mainly wanted to do when he first inherited the site was to excavate. They wanted to excavate as much, if not all of it, as possible. And they also wanted to re-erect some of the fallen stones, and they also wanted to straighten some of the stones that were leaning. As you can see, this is the facade, the northeast facing facade when you visit Stonehenge. It's the bit you sort of walk past closely, etc. But by 1881, their approach was rather different. Rather than just being interested in excavating, they were also concerned about the state of Stonehenge. It was being presented as a site that was essentially an accident waiting to happen. The stones were about to fall down. But what had actually happened between, say, the late 1860s and the early 1880s for this change of opinion? I mean, nothing had happened to Stonehenge. Nothing had happened to make the stones more likely to fall. What happened instead was Sir John Lubbock's legislation, which changed the nature of the debate and the discussion about Stonehenge. There's very little concern with the condition of Stonehenge prior to Lubbock presenting his first draft bill. In a way, it sort of gave the archaeological community another stick to beat an uncooperative landowner with, because suddenly the public debate is about the fact that he's allowing Stonehenge to fall into disrepair rather than he's refusing archaeologists to access it. And it's so interesting to point out that Sir Edmund Antrobus was an MP. He was in the same party as Sir John Lubbock, and he was arguing against the bill from the same side of the House. And although he did raise the issues of property ownership and the infringement on the rights of property owners, his main argument against putting Stonehenge into state guardianship was that he felt he would be a far better custodian of the site than people who wanted to excavate and restore. This is another of the photos taken by his architect in 1881. What John Jenkins Cole had actually been asked to do by Sir Edmund Antrobus in response to the complaints of the archaeological community was undertake effectively a condition survey of the site, with the aim of showing which, if any, of the stones were in danger of falling. This is one of the photographs he took, and this sort of image appears quite a lot as an example of the condition that Stonehenge was in. This is stone 56, the tallest stone on the site. Cole actually took this photograph with the express intention of demonstrating that that stone was not in danger of falling, okay, which is exactly the reverse of the way it's usually presented. The idea was partly to compare it with some existing photos that had been taken over 20 years earlier, in addition to measured surveys to demonstrate it had not moved at all in the intervening period, and indeed possibly had not moved for some considerable time before that. What Cole and Antrobus and others didn't realise at the time was that there were depictions of Stonehenge going back to the 16th century earlier that show this stone leaning at an alarming angle. So you can tell it always has been leaning at an alarming angle, and there's a debate to be had from the available section drawings of its stone hole as to whether it was actually at rest and how long it had been leaning. Because its neighbour is collapsed and broken lying beside it, and the idea is that there has been this collapse. It's slightly awkward because its neighbour, which it would have shared a lintel with, lies across its post hole, which is a stone hole, which is an unnatural place for it to land. So there is a question as to whether that trilithon ever stood upright and whether the collapse happened at the moment of construction. Anyway, Antrobus did end up making one intervention on the advice of his architect, which is the thing that you can see over on the far right, which Pitt Rivers referred to as a gallows-like erection. So I was talking to Sarah about this beforehand. When Paul Backhouse was here, he was talking about the fact that in crowdsourcing photographs of Stonehenge now, there are certain directions that people tend not to photograph, or at least don't put their photos online about. This problem of people avoiding particular angles is something that goes back into the 19th century. It was a nightmare trying to find photographs of this. I found the documentation that existed. I found people complaining about it, but you could not find a photograph amongst the many from the late 19th century that actually showed it. But there are many where the angle seems to have been carefully chosen to avoid capturing that thing on the photographs. It stood for 20 years. Obviously, it would be an ideal way of dating photographs where we're unsure of the date if it was visible, but it's at the point now where you think it's so carefully hidden, maybe that photo is taken after that was erected. So as I say, this is Antrobus's only intervention, and the terms in which he justified it are interesting because he didn't make many public statements about what he was doing, but the one that he made about this essentially paraphrases William Morris's manifesto for the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. And he also echoes the words of John Ruskin in terms of the approach to restoration. Essentially, Antrobus is anti-restoration in a Ruskin and Morris way. He's opposed to re-erecting stones, he's opposed to straightening them. He actually says if there was a situation where he could guarantee that if that stone collapsed, it would happen at night when there was nobody on the site, then that's what he would let happen. But for the safety of visitors, he thought there was a justification for intervening in this sort of timber prop way, which is what Ruskin and Morris also talk about as the only acceptable kind of intervention. So rather than neglecting Stonehenge, effectively for the last 3 decades of the 20th century, the site was managed according to the ideas of Ruskin and Morris. I'm not aware of any other site where that actually happened. If anybody knows, I'd love to hear. So we jump forward to 20 years to 1901 and things change quite drastically. The third Sir Edmund has died in 1898. His son, Sir Edmund IV, is sort of black-headed about it, isn't it? Has taken over. The last night of the 19th century, which is 31st December 1900, a stone fell. Stone on the outer circuit, one that nobody identified as being in danger of falling before. And this set in train a series of events which led to the first modern excavation at Stonehenge, the first actual intervention in terms of raising a stone up level. And it also led to the first enclosure of Stonehenge and the first introduction of an admission charge. Which I'll talk a little bit more about those later. This is another of those interesting photographs which occurs time and time again, and where the sort of caption, the information that you're told about it, isn't entirely satisfactory from my point of view. The guy in the centre is William Gowland, who's the man who was responsible for the excavations, which for the first time a date was offered for when Stonehenge was constructed. He suggested the very beginning of the early Bronze Age, which is not the same as someone now saying it dates the beginning of the early Bronze Age, because his understanding of Neolithic and Bronze Age very different to ours, very different criteria, very different understanding of what those periods meant. I mean, effectively, he's sort of grasping at straws to try and place the site on what he thought was the right side of the dividing line between savagery and barbarism. But the interesting thing about this photo, of course, is that this guy is never identified in the captions and very rarely mentioned in the text, because that's the man who was actually in charge of the work on the site. That's a guy called Detmar Blow, who's an architect. He's an arts and crafts architect who'd been a friend of both Ruskin and Morris. And he planned the work that took place on the site in conjunction with, get the name right, Philip Webb, friend of Morris. One of the interesting things about this process is discovering, or one of my colleagues actually discovered it, Rebecca Lane, an archive belonging to the Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings, which, as far as I can see, has never been consulted in looking at the history of Stonehenge. And in fact, in 1902, Gowland published his report on this work in Archaeology, which is obviously referred to constantly, because it was, a major development in the understanding of the site. Blow published his report the same year in the Journal of the Royal Institute of British Architects, and until our Stonehenge Landscape book in 2015, it had never been cited in an archaeological publication. It's just sort of completely blinkered view as to where we go to find our information about Stonehenge from. Archaeologist, yes. Architect, no. And obviously Blow's approach to intervention at Stonehenge is quite interesting. An arts and crafts architect, he had his team of workers, his community of craftsmen. The idea was that they would all move around from site to site. He would live on site with them. In fact, he spent most of his time with the ladies of the big houses that he was working on. He was already known to landowners in the area. He'd actually been involved in refurbishing or even building some of the grand houses in the surrounding countryside, and was working on one of Sir Edmund Antrobus's properties at the time when the stone fell. See, it's a slightly different approach to Ruskin and Morris, but Blow had already been involved in situations with churches and other buildings. This idea of restoring fabric using concrete as a hidden support, which is exactly what he did here. Unreinforced concrete was used to secure the stone once it was straightened. And the mixing and working of concrete is sort of mixed into the routines of work that his craftsmen are dealing with. This concrete is, with one or two exceptions, essentially a locally sourced material. And as we discovered, not necessarily at Stonehenge, we haven't seen that in writing yet, but certainly at other sites where this approach was taken, the aggregate would include debris from around the stones, including at Devil's Den, famously, where there is a statement saying, yes, you can use the bits of sarsen that you find in the excavations to mix as aggregate into the concrete. So this is what happened to Stone 56. You visit the site now, it's standing tall and proud and alone, as it probably never did. There were objections at the time, many objections. This was a hugely contentious piece of work, not just because of the fence and the admission charge, but because, as people pointed out, that the appearance of the monument had been changed overnight at a stroke. One complaint was that no one would ever again experience the monument that Turner and Constable painted, because this leaning stone is a central feature of so much of the 18th and 19th century art that features Stonehenge. And then we jump forward a couple of decades again. So by this time, Cecil and Mary Chubb have handed Stonehenge over to state guardianship. The Office of Works have sort of jumped in on it and started doing the kind of thing under Charles Peers, the Inspector of Ancient Monuments at the time, that they were doing it mainly at sort of medieval abbey and monastery sites at the time, which is this sort of shoring up the fabric, cleaning the surrounding areas and so on, just making a sort of nice, pleasant site to visit with not too much grass to have to tread over, etc., etc. This is the facade of Stonehenge looking out from the inside. So we're looking northeast here on the orientation of the monument itself. The restoration work began in 19, and the idea was that it would run alongside the programs of excavation. The restoration work was being managed by the Office of Works under the leadership of Sir Charles Peers. The excavations were being run for the Society of Antiquaries under their secretary, Sir Charles Peers. He actually wrote to himself asking for permission and wrote back to himself granting said permission, agreeing with the plans that he himself had proposed. The excavations were managed on the ground by Colonel William Hawley. The idea initially was that everything would be led by the restoration process, and the excavations would take place according to whichever stones were being fiddled with at the time. But the restoration work ran into problems very, very quickly. The first stones to be tackled were those two that Antrobus had the wooden gallows erected on. The situation was that one of the uprights was leaning inwards and one of them was leaning outwards, and the lintel on top was sort of raised and twisted. So the idea was that they would be straightened on the lintel, put back at rest, and it would all look nice again. So a contraption similar to this is erected around the stones. They're brought up to the perpendicular, then they're lifted. Hawley excavates the stone holes, and the idea was that there would be a clear footprint at the bottom of the stone hole showing you where the stone would go back, except there wasn't. Once the two stone holes had been excavated, there was no clear sign at all where the stone should go, let alone how high above the ground the lintel should be standing. So there was a committee meeting on site to decide what to do. They did initially consider going to Flinders Petrie's survey of 1881 or so, because obviously Petrie was surveying sites to within a thousandth of an inch of their lives. But they eventually settled on allowing Hawley to make the decision on the basis of his knowledge, expertise and skilled judgment. So he decided where the stone should go and how high the lintel should be. Because the lintel had been twisted and raised, there was this concern that it might have weathered and the mortise and tenon joint wouldn't be as snug as it should be. So a decision was taken to help plug any potential gap. There was some debate about what to use. Any copper alloy was ruled out because you ended up with green staining dribbling down. Aluminium was discussed, but it turned out that nobody on site knew what aluminium was or what it could do. And they eventually settled on lead, which was actually smelted on site and then poured on top of the lintel put in place. And the lead actually comes from the roof of Hampton Court. So that's our Tudor phase at Stonehenge. Okay? Charles Peers, as soon as he realised this was happening, put a stop to it because the intention had been that this would happen all the way around. That's the only place where Tudor lead was put in place. After stone 6 and 7 had been sorted, they moved on to the facade. I don't know if you remember that photo from 1881, but the two central stones are leaning outwards and the two either side of it are sort of upright. When the two central stones were brought to an upright position, the lintels with their neighbours didn't fit anymore. In other words, the idea that the stones had always been perfectly perpendicular suddenly became very problematic. And so the two stones either side and a couple of blue stones in front had to be fiddled with in order to make everything look okay. And that's the point at which Peers gets cold feet and stops the restoration process, because he realises he's not putting it back, he's creating something that had never existed. You know, not that people have been telling him that already before he even started. And in fact, when you get into the 1930s, when the officer works are being asked why they haven't gone back to continue the plan that was originally published to restore many more stones, they actually say quite specifically that they would be leaving themselves open to charges of faking Stonehenge. But then you get to the 1950s and it happens anyway. And Stuart Piggott and Richard Atkinson. I always mention Piggott because Atkinson always gets blamed for what happened in the 50s, particularly in terms of the lack of record keeping, but Stuart Piggott was there as well. I haven't looked into this into any more detail because there is so much more detail dealing with this period and afterwards. But one of the interesting things is that it's stated quite explicitly at the time that one of the rationales for doing this is to make Stonehenge more of a spectacle for the visitor, more of an authentic experience for the visitor. It will attract people and it will attract money. This is the Office of Works justification in Parliament for doing it. Mortimer Wheeler, who had previously been a critic of this kind of thing, including Alexander Keeler's work at Avebury, where he talks about creating 20th century sham rather than restoring, found himself in the unfortunate position of being secretary of the Society of Antiquities at the time this was going on. And each year the secretary would do a lecture to the society which would be published, and I do advise reading the one where he writes about this because it is the subtlest criticism I've come across. You know? He sticks his boot in, but very, very softly and gently. Moving to the landscape. So there's a long history of ideas about the setting of Stonehenge. Yeah, it never looked like this. One of the things I keep having to impress on people is that Turner and Constable weren't documentary artists. They stopped saying that Stonehenge looks like or not like the monument that was painted. But one of the interesting things is, and this is something that Helen Wixted has written about, is the way in which these sort of artistic depictions of Stonehenge influence the way people expect the monument to appear when they visit the kind of setting. During the 19th and into the 20th century as well, it's quite common to see Stonehenge depicted in this sort of pastoral setting, usually with some fairly violent stuff going on in the sky and dead shepherds and everything. But This idea that Stonehenge was constructed and sat within this sort of primeval grassland pastoral landscape is something where there's obviously a sort of certain amount of biblical input into that, but becomes a mainstay of archaeology in the early 20th century via the historic geography that people like O.J.S. Crawford were learning at Oxford in the early 20th century, which is where these ideas that have been developing from the 1850s onwards in geography about reconstructing flora and fauna from geology. The ideas of the higher downland having been forested because the soils wouldn't be able to support woodland, etc. So therefore, this is the basis where the earliest settlers lived and built their monuments. I guess its most famous expression in British archaeology through Cyril Fox's The Personality of Britain, although essentially all Fox is doing is applying new distribution maps to the ideas that he's picked up from Crawford, Fleur and Peake. I mean, even the title, The Personality of Britain, is stunningly original, because people like Fleur were talking about landscapes or regions possessing a personality expressed through the soils and geology and the flora and fauna that projected. So it comes to quite a surprise to come across things like this. I've not been able to find a colour version of this, but this is a painting of Stonehenge in the late 19th century showing arable agriculture, harvesting happening quite close. This is something that's missing not just from artistic depictions from the 19th century, but also from the way people write about the site. People are just not referring to things that shouldn't be there. So we go back to 1881 and we can see how close arable is. There's the bank and ditch of Stonehenge, and how close the farm buildings and cottages associated with that are. That's just over 400 yards to the west of Stonehenge, Fargo Cottages, which subsequently became the Custodians Cottages at the end of the 19th century. But at this stage, nobody was talking about restoring the landscape. There were some whinges about cultivation happening, but it was generally seen as sort of aesthetic problem rather than anything else, apart from some complaints that cultivation was a stage too far advanced to be happening in the landscape that Stonehenge belonged in. The big change was the establishment of the First World War Aerodrome in the autumn of 1917. Stonehenge, I don't know if you can see, is there. The current visitor centre is up here, so this vast airfield appears, and it's there for the last year and a half of the war. And then when Trenchard's plans for the RAF were published, the idea is that the Stonehenge Aerodrome will become a permanent base, which obviously leads to protests. People don't want it there, and eventually he relents. This one's closed, and Old Sarum gets a reprieve. That's where flying moves to. But the existence of this aerodrome, particularly its continued existence after the First World War, is the point at which people start objecting to modern intrusions in the landscape. The aerodrome becomes the sort of touchstone for debate about what is and what isn't acceptable or appropriate within the landscape around Stonehenge. These borders around the archaeological features are simply completely bogus. It's to give the impression that the archaeological sites, in this case the Barrow Cemetery close to Stonehenge, is being protected in some way, but those fences didn't exist on the ground. And also any archaeological features that exist within the area of the aerodrome have simply been missed off. Again, there's not many photographs of the aerodrome in use. People visiting Stonehenge avoided taking photos looking in that direction. It's very frustrating. This photograph is the only one I've seen, aerial photograph, actually features both Stonehenge and the aerodrome buildings to give you an idea of how close they were. And this is taken in 1928, 6 years after the aerodrome has closed, and a couple of years after Hawley's excavations are finished, although his site and the site museum and the toilet are still standing. One of the problems with the aerodrome is that once it had been decided to close, the standard procedure was that the buildings would be auctioned off, people would buy them, and they would be given 3 months to dismantle them. The guy who owned the land and of whom it was requisitioned managed to acquire most of the buildings and then asked the site the land to be given back to him. And he promised, honestly, I will take the buildings down. So that he was given back the land. And at that point, the requirement to dismantle became legally unenforceable. So he turned the existing hangars into pedigree animal breeding facilities, with specialising in pigs. But interestingly, the accommodation office blocks he actually rented out as living accommodation to people. Apparently, families or people involved with the military camps just to the north. This is something I need to look into, because once the site had been purchased through public appeal, they needed to be moved before the buildings could be demolished. An public appeal was launched in 1927 to raise money to buy the land on which the aerodrome stood and surrounding areas in an attempt to prevent any subsequent development or building work. And once that money had been raised, efforts were put into eradicating all surface trace of that aerodrome. Obviously, it continues to exist. This is it as earthworks in 1943. But yeah, got rid of it as quickly as they possibly could. And as I said, still occasionally visible today when the circumstances are right. Although most of this is now grassland, which makes it more difficult for us to see. We need people to be actively ploughing stuff up before we can get crop marks. What am I doing for time? I shall whiz on. The aerodrome, having been the initial focus of complaints about inappropriate modernity, there are bits and pieces. It's one of the boundary markers lurking around in the landscape still. In 1927, a gentleman called, I think it's George Billett, who lived in Amesbury, decided to open a cafe in Stonehenge Bottom, 400 yards from Stonehenge. And his daughter Margaret was in charge of running it. This was possibly the worst timing because basically it was being built as the appeal was launched. So they were no longer able to say, and who knows what could happen. They could say, if we don't buy this land, look, it's already happening. The cafe was slightly further up from the thin end of the wedge than the aerodrome had been. The objections to the cafe aren't just because it was in the Stonehenge landscape, but because of the nature of the type of premises that it was. I should also point out that the reason why it was built down there is because all the landowners had already agreed amongst themselves not to allow any building within 400 yards of the nearest stone. That's why when the Custodians Cottages were built, they were put down there as well. And in fact, the cafe was invisible from Stonehenge. From the other side, you had to go to quite a height to be able to get the cafe and Stonehenge in the same photograph. So, cafe one side of what became the A344 and the Custodians Cottages the other. Lots and lots of information exists about this structure. The cafe only stood for 11 years. It wasn't in place long enough to appear on any ordnance survey map. It's hardly unique. There are thousands and thousands of structures for which actually the only evidence we have is either earthworks or aerial photographs of them. I just wanted to quickly read David Lawrence's summary of this building and its architecture. In its form and appearance, the Stonehenge Cafe embodied a Victorian Edwardian myth of Old England as recreated by arts and crafts visionaries and reinterpreted by vernacular builders. I say that's the cafe, not Stonehenge. It's a close cousin of the semi-detached suburban villa and bungalow, a smart neo-Tudor meets Darjeeling edifice which accords with the emerging aesthetic of specialised spaces for recreation at the roadside. To examine the architectural style further, we can understand it as a cheap and efficient fusion of indigenous agricultural building features and notions of English architecture played out in North America before being imported back to Britain. It is at once a synthesis of the barn, the farmstead, and the coaching inn, adorned with sufficient visual clues to assert its place in the popular culture of the homeland. Or as Clough Williams-Ellis put it, an offensive pink bungalow with outrageous cafe adjoining. So yeah, just a rectified aerial view of it at its peak, although a complete absence of cars there. One of the interesting things about the cafe is that once the National Trust, who the land was donated to after it was brought to appeal, and the Office of Works had decided and publicly stated that the cafe had to go, it gradually dawned on them that it served quite a useful purpose, because there were no other facilities in the landscape, and there were an increasing number of visitors who wanted somewhere to park their car, who wanted somewhere to rest, and who wanted a toilet. The Office of Works advice that you have the whole plane at your disposal was not sound advice as far as many people were concerned. That's what they actually said. It's interesting that you go to the visitor centre today and you can buy this picture as a sort of little piece of nostalgia, showing the cafe on the right, the Custodians Cottages with Stonehenge on the background, car trundling through the AA blocks. There's also a greetings card version in colour not produced by English Heritage, where the car has actually been replaced by a steam traction engine, just to pile the nostalgia on. Even think of little fires glowing in the windows of the cottages as well. But, you know, as nostalgia goes, no. The buildings had to go. They were dismantled rather than being demolished, so they survived as very, very substantial earthworks. The Custodians Cottages were moved up to King Barrow Ridge, where they still stand, owned by the National Trust. They sit in amongst the Barrow Cemetery up there. But yeah, the cafe went. The owners of it built another one at Long Barrow Crossroads, the other side, but there's no official visitor facility of its kind until the late 1960s. Concrete structure was built the other side of the road. Yeah, that's the cafe earthworks you can see now. And bits of the garden survive as well. There's some hawthorns there. And interesting things turn up in the mould hills too. Now, talking about the cafe obviously brings up again the problem of visitors. One of the objections that was made about the cafe was not so much that it was close to Stonehenge, but the nature of the building itself. These sort of out-of-town roadside destinations were sort of subject to the same complaints that the bungalow was in terms of what they did to existing, class and social boundaries and so on. And in particular with cafes, they were places that they were often managed and run entirely staffed by women. They were places that women could travel and go to unaccompanied, without male accompaniment, etc. Something that still and so on. So a lot of the complaints about the Stonehenge Cafe are as much about that side of things as they are about the fact that it's too close to Stonehenge. But nonetheless, it does raise this problem that had been running since the late 19th century, that as far as certain elements of the archaeological establishment were concerned, not everybody who visited Stonehenge was the right kind of visitor to Stonehenge. In fact, this is part of the rationale behind the establishment of the fence and the admission fee in 1901. There had been demands for the last 2 or 3 decades of the 19th century to exclude anyone but the interested visitor. In other words, people who were going for picnics, people who were going for the local people, in other words. The whole point of charging a shilling was to exclude people who couldn't afford a shilling. As well, obviously causing problems. Matthew Stout's book, Creating Prehistory, talks about the main Druid group, but there are a number of sort of less official Druids visiting as well. This guy is fantastic. He used to buy copies of Cyclop and buy copies of the Bible for 6pence and take them back to his shop in Amesbury and sell them for a shilling for people getting off the train. Anything to annoy the authorities. Just looking at the time, I'll jump quickly through this. So the barbed wire first went up in 1901, as I said. Its use at the time was of uncertain legality. Barbed wire was a relatively recent invention which primarily had mainly been used to control the movement of animals through the infliction of pain. Obviously in 1901 as well, there'd been an awful lot of publicity about its use in the Boer War by both sides, and by the British side in the concentration camp and blockhouse system. And it's also the first time you get newspaper headlines about soldiers being hung on the wire like crows. It's not a First World War headline, it's a Boer War headline. And interestingly, the increasing military presence on Salisbury Plain was used as a reason for enclosing the site with barbed wire, which sort of smacks of insensitivity to a fair degree as well. And as I said, the admission charge was largely introduced for 2 reasons. One, the 4th Sir Edmund wanted to demonstrate that a site he wanted to sell was capable of generating an income, and 2, it was to exclude people, particularly the local people who visited and revisited, who just wouldn't be able to afford to access the site anymore. I'm going to skip the rounding up because you've probably got the main gist of it. But just one last thing. The most extreme plans for excluding or controlling visitor access came in the late 1920s. The idea was that some of the money from the public appeal would fund this. The idea was to dig a ha-ha around the entire Stonehenge landscape. This was actually properly drawn up plans. It was fully costed. Although it turned out the money wasn't available, the appeal wasn't that successful. But if we take a close look at what was planned, we have a deep ditch going around the entire site, and it's lined with a series of sharp stakes connected with strands of barbed wire. And obviously this is the inside, so the idea is that, yeah, you might be able to get in, but you ain't getting out again. The idea of a ha-ha has a long history. The Duke of Queensberry first suggested it as an idea of enclosing Stonehenge without disrupting the view. The idea of a ha-ha was finally rejected in the late 1980s. Fences remain, obviously. Anyway, so rather than recapping, I'll just finish with my favourite Sir Edmund Antrobus III quote, who in the 1880s had insisted that archaeologists were the most responsible for mischief at archaeological sites. And he said, if the ancient monuments were placed in their hands, they would do still more. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. It's a really interesting case study in site management. So I might come back and ask you some questions about that after.
That's not the real Stonehenge, by the way. That's the bouncy one.
We have time for some questions. Oh, coffee.
So you bounce on the bouncy Stonehenge.
Yeah. Good question.
Plus there were loads of kids on it, and I thought it's not going to look right if I just launched myself. There were a few people who had to do it for camera because it was a big news event. This was the day that marked the 100th anniversary. There was a giant 6-foot wide cake replica of Stonehenge with a very dubious
I'm
section.
desperately jealous, yeah.
Yeah, and there was the London Sinfonietta were playing a specially written piece in the stone. I mean, yeah, you know, percussion is fine in those conditions, but brass instruments, no. But yeah, a good time was had by me and you.
Other questions?
I'll go on then. What do you think of the road scheme?
Are you asking me as a historic England employee on camera, live on the interweb, to give you my opinion?
Well, maybe they're not, more seriously, they're not less about the road schemes, they're about the different opinions that have come through. I'm particularly interested to hear what you think of people like Dan Hicks's kind of arguments around, you know, making this landscape artificially pristine and not recording some of these changes and presenting them as part of the heritage of Stonehenge.
Yeah, I must admit the part of the whole process that does interest me most is the process, rather than what the end result is going to be, looking at the various arguments that are being put forward. And as I was saying to Sarah earlier, it's quite clear amongst the discussions of what's happening at the moment that there is an ignorance about the reasons why changes have happened in the past as well. So there is this sort of sense that you keep coming across that there has been this sort of linear progression from the initial ideas of putting it back, and what's happening now is all part and parcel of creating an appropriate landscape for it. I'm not sure that answers what your question.
Well, yes, I think it does. The danger with the road scheme is that we artificially take a particular perspective of Stonehenge that is of the moment archaeologically and make it.
There is that debate to be had as well about what features in the Stonehenge landscape contribute to OUV and whether OUV actually includes things like the A303 as it was at the time of designation, and that's part of the experience. So, because the OUV isn't just Neolithic and Early Bronze Age, it's about responses to those features in subsequent periods as well. And obviously pretty much everything that's happened in that landscape since the 3rd millennium BC is in some way a response to the fact that that thing is there.
Other questions?
I'll ask a question. How much of this work, Martyn, your research, is going to feed into historic England, or I guess English Heritage's interpretation of this monument? Because so much of what they do is sell this pristine Neolithic monument. And, you know, how are they going to start telling the public that what they're looking at is, you know, partially at least the 19th century?
Well, obviously I can't speak for English Heritage, but from my interactions with site staff, including I was there last Tuesday, I actually gave one of the 100th anniversary talks about Stonehenge and the Great Wall. And one of the problems is that the visitor centre displays were conceived long before I had actually put any of this stuff in print. Interestingly, they are 2 of the most downloaded reports that we produced, to the extent that you can actually buy copies if you want a physical one rather than just download the PDF. But yeah, the site staff are all aware of it. They use both those reports to deal with questions on site. I don't know if there are definite plans to improve the signposting for some of these features, but I do some of the visitor tours where I talk largely about the restoration rather than what happened in prehistory. Other people can do that. So there is an acceptance of it at the visitor centre and among the staff there, and it's talked about, and there's no concealing it. It's just that the displays at present tend to reflect the Neolithic and Bronze Age, although some of the temporary displays have focused on more recent periods. There was one that featured a lot of Julian Richards' collection of contemporary recent culture. There was tat. There was one on, there's been at least one dealing with the First World War, although one specifically dealing with the Aerodrome fell through, unfortunately. But there are other First World War themed events have happened quite regularly, including having replica planes by the Neolithic reconstructed houses, which just look bizarre and surreal and very photographable. And there's an organisation, I forgot what they're called, who is loosely associated with the National Trust, who've had a number of First World War themed events there. So it's not being concealed or hidden from the visitors, it's just that it's not currently reflected in the permanent displays.
I have a real question now. Well, the other was a real question. I was just looking and see we last spoke about the Battle of Beanfield in 2015. Has there been anything since? And is there anything we could do to have that commemorated at Stonehenge?
My sense is that would be difficult at Stonehenge itself, but not impossible. I mean, there is a long recent history of not just the Battle of Beanfield, but a number of other incidents, events, interest in Stonehenge that could be worked into something. You know, one of the interesting things that's come out of the recent landscape scale geophysical surveys is a much better understanding of the festival sites, for instance. And there is a lot of extant documentation that hasn't been looked at related to those. The Beanfield is, I would like something to happen. I would like it to be acknowledged, and I would like the wider context to be mentioned rather than it just being an adjunct to a troublesome festival.
John, also.
Yes, I've got a comment actually just on that previous exchange. So I was going to mention this anyway, but I first came across the Battle of Beanfield through my own work. Nowhere near Stonehenge, but in Bristol, when Rachel and I were doing that work with homeless people, and a number of the people brought up references to Battle of Beanfield and stories of having been there and trying to get to Stonehenge. And Stonehenge was a real focal point in their lives back then, trying to get to the site and ending up at the Battle of Beanfield and being involved in that battle and so on. And so when they heard that we were archaeologists, this was the story that they wanted to tell us. So, and there were a number of people who'd ended up in Bristol and ended up homeless in Bristol, in fact, who have stories, really interesting to tell about that particular incident and the the events leading up to it. So there's a wider story, and it's a story that can be told and uncovered sometimes through the most surprising.
Yeah, and the wider connections as well with the miners' strike, obviously the same.
Yeah,
and things like, you know,
yes.
I was a teenager at the time, and I lived in the east of Kent, but you know, I would be processing along the road with more than one other person, because that was the law that was used to stamp on these kind of processions at the time.
Sorry, that wasn't my question.
Okay.
I was just going to ask a really simple question. We spoke about it briefly at the start, but are we getting closer to the position where there might be another Stonehenge festival, do you think?
If you want to print up the posters, I'll do the tickets.
I just get the sense that we're getting closer. Just some of the things I've read recently, in is it Paul performed there and stuff, and you know, it just seems to be seems to be getting a little bit more relaxed about the possibility that we might get to that position again. I think,
Yeah, there are some interesting themed events have been happening at Stonehenge, particularly now that English Heritage needs to be self-funding. And